So for those of you who don't know me, and for the sake of the recording, I'm Noah Hajduk-Dell. I'm a professor at Centenary University, a history professor. And I actually wrote this for a conference, but it's the least academic thing I've ever written for academic purposes, if that makes sense. I've written some other very casual things, but this is, sort of semi-historical. There's some research that went into it, but also a lot of the stories that, from my time there. So you all might remember a few summers ago, the term birding, the active term birders prefer over the passive sounding bird watching, as my students have learned from me, can be highly politicized in this country. You might remember the altercation between Amy Cooper, the dog walker, and Christian Cooper, unrelated, the African-American birder in Central Park on May 25th, 2020. That's both my birthday and the place where I first learned to love birds and birding. With that incident in mind, it should be no surprise that even this most innocent of pastimes is often highly politicized in Israel and Palestine, right? If it is in New York, then you can only imagine. More than a decade ago now, my family and I spent a year in Jerusalem, a complex and divided city, so that I could conduct research for my doctoral dissertation. I focused my attention on Palestinian Christians and their relationship to nationalism during the British Mandate period, 1920 to 48, and I spent my days in the archives reading British reports, Zionist intelligence files, and newspapers from the nascent Palestinian press. It was fascinating work, as I'm sure you'd all agree, but I was anxious to engage in birding, a hobby that would get me outside and relieve some of the stresses of living in Jerusalem. Yossi Leshem, a Tel Aviv University zoologist, believes that, quote, birds are common ground. There's no conflict about them. Like so many others who make absolute claims about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I was sorry to discover that he is absolutely wrong. For 3 years prior, I had lived at the corner of 51st and 9th in Midtown Manhattan while I attended New York University with my wife and 2 kids by the time we left. I grew up in Vermont, and I'm a small town boy, far more at home in the woods than in the busyness of the New York theater district. New York was a stressful place to live, and I became claustrophobic anytime I stepped out of my apartment. Ironic, given the less than 600 square feet that housed my wife and me, and eventually our first 2 children, and had zero sunlight, despite having a handful of windows. Yet we were only a half mile from Central Park, so I coped by spending an inordinate amount of time in the Ramble, one of the 2 wild sections of the park, if a heavily trailed, perfectly planned forested area counts as wild. And the Ramble is also where Christian Cooper ran into Miss Cooper. One day while I was out, I detoured through the Ramble, which is again this small patch of relatively dense forest with intertwined meandering paths that give the area its name, on my way to an Upper East Side library for a bit of research, when I happened upon an area full of bird feeders. Chickadees, nuthatches, goldfinches, cardinals, and many other birds flitted from feeder to feeder, and a small gaggle of birders watched on through binoculars. It wasn't long before I became a full-fledged birder myself, finding solitude and peace in observing the antics of the park's residents and visitors alike, both avian and human. Before traveling to Jerusalem, I bought a Birds of the Middle East guidebook. I actually didn't bring that one though, Birds of Israel. You can see it's well worn. I can pass that around if you'd like to see. And a new pair of binoculars, and I poked around on the internet to figure out what kind of common birds I might see, and I planned a few specific sites in Israel and the Palestinian territories that I really wanted to visit. At first, my plan was successful. When my wife and I walked on the promenade to the south of Jerusalem, I spotted a chiffchaff. On a trip to Masada, the historic nationalist site on a cliff overlooking the Dead Sea, I made note of the blackbirds coming to the region, but so different than ours, with their orange wings glowing in the sun as they passed overhead. I watched a pied kingfisher diving in the Jordan River at the spot where Jesus was said to have been baptized, and I spotted a glossy ibis wading in the remaining swamps at the Hula Reservoir at the base of the Golan Heights. And I admired a flock of bee-eaters as they chased bugs in the compound of the Monastery of the Cross, an Eastern Orthodox establishment built in the 11th century and granted to the church by the Emperor Constantine himself. And while walking through Sachar Park in the middle of Jerusalem, I finally saw my first hoopoe, the flamboyant bird that graces the cover of most birding publications in the Middle East, although neither of the 2 that I brought to show you. It's on the other one that I have in the car. I hadn't tried to spot, And over the course of the time I was there, let's see. Sorry, here we are. Where did my hoop go? It was exciting every time I saw a new species, and every species was new to me, since, with the exception of house finches, of course, they're everywhere in the world, kestrels and pigeons, though the latter species looked far more spectacular when soaring through the desert canyon near the desolate Marsava Monastery than it did strutting past my apartment on 9th Ave in New York. One day I sent a list to an ornithologist friend who I knew might appreciate the diversity of species I saw. It read, Palestine sunbird, jay, Indian house crow, chiffchaff, white wagtail, chaffinch, European robin, Syrian woodpecker, great tit, blackbird, yellow-vented bulbul, graceful warbler, cormorant, kestrel, and redstart, as well as the internationalized pigeon and house sparrow. And of course, the 17 species I saw that day, and the probably 60 or 70 species I saw over the year to come, were only a fraction of the 500 species that either live in or pass through the region. I hadn't tried to spot every bird, and I didn't plan a single trip just for the sake of birding, so I was completely satisfied with my list. But birding did not turn out to be a sanctuary in the midst of a conflicted region. Rather, I noted again and again that both environmental landscapes and human mentalities in Israel and Palestine are fully shaped by the ongoing political conflict. I was reminded of this recently when reading Environmentalism Deferred by Shaw Cohen, in which he argues that environmentalism in Palestine-Israel operates within a context that is bounded by existential concerns, and as such, it is subsumed by a meta-narrative that makes a marginal impact and, in many respects, irrelevant in the context of discourses on land, resources, and power. What's true for environmentalism is equally true for its parts, of which bird conservation and ornithological concerns are one, particularly since the eastern shore of the Mediterranean provides an essential flyway for birds migrating between Africa and Eurasia. This was the first slide, and that's the blackbird that I mentioned. It's just called a blackbird, but it's got these cool orange wings, and that picture was taken at Masada, which again is a fascinating story all of its own, and I have a lot of thoughts about it. But this is why I go from a script, because otherwise I'd get off telling you the story of Masada.
We have the movie.
Okay. And then here, these are birds. The bottom two are pictures that I took at the bird sanctuary in Jerusalem, which I'll tell you about in a moment. The middle one is a wryneck. It's crazy. It's got this long neck that it can twist around. And then the bottom one is a kingfisher. The top one is a shrike, which I also saw a number of. They're amazing birds. Shrikes keep larders in a tree, usually around here, like a hawthorn tree that has long spikes on it, and they'll catch grasshoppers and mice even, and they'll stick them on the branches, and they can come back and eat them whenever they want.
That's so smart.
It's incredible. I've never seen this. I'm dying to find one in the woods. I've only seen a handful of shrikes ever. So anyway, after spending hours examining old documents in the Central Zionist Archive, I would take my time walking home, often ending up at a man-made pond with an adjacent birding shelter called the Jerusalem Bird Observatory. And this is this is the place. That's the pond and a couple of the birds that I'll talk about in a moment. It's a special little place carved out of the center of Jerusalem, surrounded by the Knesset building, which is their parliament and courthouse. The pond, which of course have been in the news a lot recently with massive protests outside the Knesset. The pond is small and overgrown, just perfect for attracting a wide variety of birds. It was there that I spotted the iridescent white-breasted kingfisher, I guess that's not that one, and a camouflaged wryneck twisting its head awkwardly on its too long neck. At the time, the JBO, Jerusalem Bird Observatory, proudly have displayed pictures of President Jimmy Carter visiting the center, a suggestion perhaps that birding and peace were somehow related. Current Jerusalem Bird Observatory flyers do not feature the former president, and I can't help but wonder if his picture was removed after he published his controversial book, Peace, Not Apartheid. Their most current brochure explains that, quote, Israel has a rich multicultural fabric with a wide variety of social, ethnic, and religious groups, which often come into conflict with one another, but it doesn't mention Palestinians or Arabs by name. Still, one of the strongest characteristics of the Society for the Protection of Nature's activities in Jerusalem is the ability to recruit supporters from different backgrounds around a common unifying cause, birds, or the environment, right? I admire their apolitical or even coexistence-oriented approach, but I still wanted to know what their Palestinian counterparts thought of the Bird Observatory and its work. Not surprisingly, that's 3. Okay, so there's Jimmy Carter. Not surprisingly, the political conflict and continued statelessness of the Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza means that Palestinians have minimal financial and political support for environmental research. The, quote, premier bird watcher in the West Bank, every place has got theirs, Anton Khalile, explains that bird watching is a luxurious hobby, but because of the political situation and the lack of funds and money and experience, we don't bird watch. Despite this assessment, Palestinians often discuss the importance of the environment as an element of the Palestinian homeland, which is also true in Israel. But the Palestine Wildlife Society is still an underfunded, minuscule operation, focused mostly on educational opportunities for Palestinian youth. With a 30% unemployment rate and more than double that in Gaza, most people have plenty of other things to worry about. So it was a warm, dry day, like almost every day in the area, when I took an Arab minibus, as opposed to the Israeli buses, to the wall that surrounds Bethlehem. And I made my way on foot through various layers of dehumanizing security fences, and I caught a cab on the far side of the wall. The cab dropped me off at the Society's office on a nondescript street in Beit Sahur, one of Bethlehem's neighboring villages. I was met by Imad Fuad Atrash, a gentle Palestinian man who had an obvious passion for birds and was excited to share about the Society's activities in the West Bank. He was particularly eager to show me the copies of a newly printed, first complete ever Arabic language bird book. They're very excited about this. There had never been a bird book in Arabic before, complete at least. There had probably been, there were things like this, which I can also pass around. This one, let's see if I can't read this script. Something about the life of the environment in Palestine, in the Gaza Strip. And so it's got birds, and so this one might just be about birds. This one here is about everything. It's got birds and plants and other animals. And interestingly, the first half is fully in English, and the second half, and then, so if you start from this side, it's in English. If you start from this side, it's in Arabic. I assume the same book, more or less. But this is their information from their website. Lovely people, but just not a lot of interest because, again, they've got other more important things to worry about. Anyway, he eventually, as you can see, sold me a copy of this book that he was so excited about. He also told me about the Society's bird banding efforts at the sanctuary in Jericho, educational programs for Palestinian kids, and their effort to cooperate on research projects with the Jerusalem Bird Observatory. As a student of the conflict, I was particularly fascinated by this last bit of information, right? They're cooperating around birds. What a wonderful thing. He explained that the white stork, I'm going to keep doing that if I have it, that the white stork, which, as you can see from the map, migrates both across from Africa to Spain, but also even more from Africa up along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, right over the heads of Palestinians and Israelis. Let's see, this is why, he told me about this, let's see. He explained that the particular type of stork, the white stork, which winters in Africa and travels to back to Turkey for the summer, uses a corridor between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River as its main migration route. The birds, of course, don't care if they're over Israel or the West Bank, so it's helpful to have visual tracking from across the region. What a great way to look beyond political differences, I thought, to focus on migratory birds and scientific research, something that is completely outside the realm of politics. So a week later, I ran into one of the leaders of the Jerusalem Bird Observatory, and I asked him about the Palestine Wildlife Society. He scoffed at the idea that the Arab organization helped at all and dismissed them as a poorly funded, unprofessional group. I was a bit deflated, having been led to believe that the two environmentally minded groups were working side by side to further ornithological research in the region. It turns out that I was frustrated by a single feather on the wing of a much larger bird. Perhaps the most beautiful of the common birds that lands on the flowering vines that climbed the walls of our apartment building in Jerusalem was the Palestine sunbird. So that's the Palestine sunbird on a Palestine Authority stamp. An iridescent blue gem with a long curved beak, somewhat reminiscent of a hummingbird in size and behavior, although it can't hover like a hummingbird can. It's the type of bird, though, that it just can't be ignored. It's too beautiful. Like a cardinal or an oriole, it simply screams for attention. The bird was given its Latin name, Cinereus osseus, by Charles Lucien Bonaparte, the nephew of the famous French emperor himself. After dabbling in American ornithology for a time alongside John James Audubon, the ornithologist Bonaparte settled in Europe, where at the end of his life, he set to work cataloging all the birds in the world. He was successful in one of the ways that very few birders are. He has a bird named after him, actually more than one. The Bonaparte's gull, which is a common sight along our Jersey shore. If you've ever seen a gull with a black head, small gull with a black head, there are a couple of them. There's a black-headed gull and the laughing gull. Those are also black-headed, not the laughing gull, I'm sorry, the black-headed gull, but the Bonaparte's gull is one of them. I always thought it was because it looked like it was wearing a helmet like Bonaparte, but it's not. It's because of Bonaparte's nephew, Charles. In any event, he also named the Palestine sunbird in the mid-1800s at a time when many birds didn't have a common name yet, at least a common name that was shared outside of the region. Surely the Palestine sunbird was called something else by the locals, but it wasn't known yet to outsiders. So Bonaparte took advantage of the opportunity and named it after the region in which he spotted it, Palestine. A decade or more ago, I have an article announcing this effort's failure from 2013. A group of Israeli birders and scientists began lobbying the appropriate international organizations to change the name of the Palestine sunbird to something, well, something less acknowledging of a place called Palestine. The orange sunbird was the proposed alternative. Right, you can see the little tiny orange on the wing. That was why they were going to change the name from Palestine to orange. The effort was unsuccessful, and Ibrahim Auda, a spokesperson for the Palestine Wildlife Society, declared, "We have successfully halted the Israeli campaign, and the bird's name cannot be changed for the sake of an Israeli demand which is based on the Israeli hatred of the name of Palestine." The Palestine Wildlife Society responded to this news by encouraging the Palestinian Authority to declare the Palestine sunbird as their national bird, hoping that making such an official statement would prevent similar efforts in the future. Auda argued that, quote, "The Israelis have not been able to accomplish their goal and change the bird's name with the international institutions." He said, "We cannot, however, claim that we have won the confrontation unless the Palestinian presidency and premiership approve and announce the bird as the national bird of Palestine," he said. "Only then will we be victorious in our environmental confrontation with the Israelis." The Palestinian government complied in 2015. I had a lot of fun trying to track down variations in bird names. Actually, I almost brought that book too. I have a bird called Whose Name Is This Bird, or Whose Bird Is This Name, or something like that. And it's a bird that, it's a book. It's not a bird. It's a book that goes through all of the birds that are named after people. It's really interesting. So the Swainson's thrush is named after somebody, and the Harris's hawk in the Southwest. I have stories about all these birds, but I can't tell them now. Anyway, so they're all named after people. So I came across that book as a result of this paper. So I had a lot of fun doing this. The Palestine sunbird is among a list of birds viewed in Palestine at an 1869 meeting of the zoological branch of the Bristol's Naturalist Society. Perhaps more interesting is that in the Handbook of Palestine, edited by British Mandate officials, Harry Charles Luke and Edward Keith Roach, a list of local birds, and this would have been the 1920s at this point. A list of local birds includes not only the Palestine sunbird, but also the Palestine bulbul. Remember that name. It was clearly a common name at the time. Not only did Keith Roach and his party shoot a Palestine bulbul and a Palestine sunbird on his 1915 expedition across Sinai and up to Jerusalem, but they also shot a Palestine sparrow, a Palestine rock sparrow, a Palestine great tit, a Palestine green finch, and a Palestine blackstart as well. I have thus far been unsuccessful in my research in discovering when these names dropped the Palestine label. So back in 2008, Israel held a vote to determine an important symbol of state, the state bird. But this particular contest was quite controversial. Here you can see the three candidates. The Palestine sunbird. I don't know if you can make him out in the middle of the center picture. He's there. I took these pictures, so I used them even though they're not the best. You've already seen a good picture of the Palestine sunbird, so I got to go with my photography. They're really hard to take pictures of because they're floating around constantly. The Palestine sunbird. The problem with which I already described to you in some detail. The other two had similarly complicated issues. The yellow-vented bulbul, a vent in the birding world, is a place from which the animal defecates. So that is our yellow-vented bulbul in the bottom left. It's kind of nightingale. And it's the same one that used to be called the Palestine bulbul, but that's not the problem. The problem is that in Hebrew, bulbul is the slang for male genitalia. The third candidate was the hoopoe. Again, my picture from the first hoopoe I saw. Well, I think we'll see it closer up. Actually, here you go. There's some better pictures of them. So these are our three choices. But yeah, it said, and here, let me flip to photos I took to professional photos, much better. But it too had a problem. In the Bible, in Leviticus chapter 11, Moses passes on God's laws, including this one. These are the birds you are to regard as unclean and not eat because they are unclean. The eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the red kite, any kind of black kite, any kind of hawk, no, any kind of raven, I'm sorry, any kind of raven, the horned owl, the screech owl, the gull, any kind of hawk, the little owl, the cormorant, the great owl, the white owl, the desert owl, the osprey, the stork, any kind of heron, the hoopoe, and the bat. It's worth noting that the hoopoe shows up in the Quran as well for having aggravated King Solomon by returning late from an assignment given by the king himself. So perhaps the prohibition on eating the hoopoe stems from its unique way of protecting its nest. It secretes a stinking odor from a special gland, which is spread in the nest, leaving the chicks very smelly and keeping predators like cats, snakes, and other predatory birds at a distance. Most of the time, this trick works and the chicks end up leaving the nest healthy and strong. It looks like this nesting trick worked well all over Europe, Asia, and Africa, the old world, because the hoopoe was found all over those continents. But whether due to this or the young hoopoes, that young hoopoes can, while still in the nest, shoot liquid feces at predators, God prohibited Jews from eating them. So who to offend then? Prospective voters had to ask themselves, do you offend the nationalists? Do you offend the Orthodox Jewish community? Or do you risk giving a headache to every elementary school teacher who has to teach about the state bird? And the winner is the hoopoe. I wasn't that surprised that 155,000 voters opted to steer clear of the Palestine sunbird. No, it was the hoopoe that took top honors, despite being specifically designated as non-kosher. There you go. There's the hoopoe. Yeah, they're just incredible birds, just beautiful. And again, you can see them all over Europe too. I did not see one there. I only saw it. Let's see. Some birding controversies took place within Israel itself over environmental issues. Back in the late 40s and early 50s, in the first decade of Israel's existence, the nascent country was a destination for thousands of immigrants fleeing Europe, as well as Arab countries across the Middle East. As they settled in Israel, the country had two problems: not enough food and not enough room. The Hula Valley, once more the 5 square mile Hula Lake, just north of the Sea of Galilee, was slated as a perfect spot to expand agriculture. Just drain the lake, plant some crops, and voila. As is too often the case, the initial success was praised. Malaria in the region declined dramatically, and new farmlands were added to Israel's collection. But other, perhaps wiser people soon realized that the environmental trade-off was greater than they had imagined, with some marsh birds and frogs actually going extinct because of the drainage, such as the Hulu painted frog pictured here. The picture on the right I also took. It's an ibis in the water. We didn't go at the right time of year. Like I said, I didn't plan my trips around birds. I had a family to worry about, and I also had work to worry about. But this was our opportunity to get up there. So we went and still saw a handful of really amazing birds. So when I started researching birds on Israel and Palestine, I immediately came across a number of, I did like any good researcher does. I started with Google, right? You're supposed to. But still, it's actually a wonderful place to do research. And I immediately came across a number of articles about tagged raptors that were shot down by Hezbollah militants on the Lebanon border. They were convinced that the tagged birds were spying for Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service. In the article on this slide, it was an endangered Bonelli's eagle that was captured, and in this case, later released by skeptical Lebanese militants. The two quotes from the article are fascinating. The first explains that part of the eagle population issue is that early Zionist farmers pointed to birds in the early part of the 20th century for agricultural reasons. The second quote explains that there have been a number of animals accused of espionage in recent years. Right? Other Israeli spies suspected Israeli spies include the common kestrel, a European bee-eater in Turkey, 2 Egyptian vultures, and a pelican in Sudan, a griffin vulture in Saudi Arabia, a common kestrel and a wolf in Jordan, a school of sharks and a stork in Egypt, and a barn owl in Syria, right? So, to me, this is hysterical. But it's easy to mock these Hezbollah militants, but what about the time when the Israeli Defense Force did use birds? Palestinians and other Arabs in the region remember that, of course. And here is, I think this is one of the birds, and you can see the tracker on its back. Why wouldn't that be? Are you able to see that? Can you turn the light off over there?
No, it's not that. It's me. I've got too much light in my left eye, so if I want to focus, this is what I do.
Okay, you go ahead and turn it off anyway. Just see if that helps. Yeah, right. So you can see. This must not be on. You can see on his back here. He's got this radar with an antenna sticking up. Of course, they're going to be worried, right? That's a pretty legitimate concern. So the man here is one of the original men who trained homing pigeons for the IDF during the War of Independence in 1948, or al-Nakba, the catastrophe, as it's called in Palestinian parlance. It's not a stretch to think that the IDF would employ birds in its continued fight with Lebanese militants. But it's really with the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis where my fascination lies. Patricia Campbell, writing on Susan Rosenthal's blog, reflects on birds' relationship to the conflict in an entry titled, "In Palestine, Not Even the Birds Are Free." She writes about crossing a heavily militarized border between Israel and the Gaza Strip. To my right were large rocks surrounded by garbage, empty drink cans and food wrappings, an indication of disdain for this restricted area. The rocks were topped with winding and tangled razor wire. A little bird flew into the wire and got tangled. As it struggled in vain to escape, I looked away to avoid witnessing its miserable fate. I thought, not even the birds are free in Palestine. These pictures give some indication of the truth behind that statement, though there's another way to look at it as well, which I will end with in a moment. But for now, starting in the top left and continuing clockwise, a flock of rock doves, aka pigeons, in front of a tank. Powerful symbolism, I think. Sorry, this page doesn't want to go. The second one, top center, is an egret waiting alone in a burned out field in southern Israel, a fire caused by an incendiary balloon launched by Hamas from the Gaza Strip. The third is a shrike, a masked shrike sitting on barbed wire, though in this case, the shrike has probably found a perfect home. And I told you about this already. Shrikes who are found here in the Americas as well, capture insects and even small rodents and impale them on thorns and trees, or maybe on barbed wire to create a larder where they store their food for later. The next one on the bottom right, art by the infamous Banksy on the walls separating Bethlehem from Israel. There's a lot of fascinating artwork there, but the notion of an olive-carrying dove with a bulletproof vest and a bullseye on its chest is another example of the powerful symbolism of birds. And finally, bottom left, the insignia of the Israeli Defense Forces Golani brigades. And I see that, and again, I think no wonder the Lebanese were worried. But let me wrap up with a different story about a moment that was, I didn't even touch it. About a moment that was at the time and is until today, rife with a different sort of symbolism. I was good friends with a guy named Shri who worked on for the humanitarian-oriented Mennonite Central Committee. One of his jobs was to check up on other organization members throughout the Palestinian territories, since he was the senior employee in the region. He invited me to join him on a long ride from Jerusalem to Zababde in the far north of the West Bank, an offer I immediately accepted. I learned a long time ago, when somebody offers you an opportunity, take it, right? And even go out of your way to make yourself opportunities. That's the best way to experience the world. So I accepted. That's my next sentence. I learned long ago. Even when I interrupt myself, I'm on script. The drive was not a short one. The driver probably wasn't either, but the drive was not a short one, at least 2.5 hours if we didn't stop. But not stopping is impossible because the road passes through a number of security checkpoints, much like the one in this picture. Here. Many were small, perhaps even temporary, but that also means that they are understaffed, and often we would be stopped for 10 or 20 minutes while we waited for the for permission to pass through. It was at one of these stops, the sort of place where Palestinians could be detained for hours while Israeli settler cars drive straight through because they have a different color license plates. They would be detained for hours, not minutes, while we were idling in the traffic. And as always, this is what I do when I drive. I always tell my kids if I ever get in an accident, it's going to be because I'm looking at a bird. So as always, I was looking at the window for birds. It's just what I do. I looked out my window toward the checkpoint ahead, and there, flying over our car, over the checkpoint and off into the West Bank, was a flock of glossy ibises, free to fly wherever they chose, uninhibited by the constraints of the conflict. It was a beautiful image and one that stayed with me for over a decade as a reminder of the freedom birds have, despite the way humans restrict one another's movement.